asked them if we could have this tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and they said we wouldn't get very many people to come out. So they decided to do this and say, who's going to win tomorrow? All right. They've been asking me, the media asks all these tough questions. It's like, sometimes you don't know the answer, and they're like, who are you rooting for? Iowa State. And I was like, well, when Iowa's got the football, I guess Iowa. When Iowa State's got the football, I guess Iowa State. That didn't go over so well, particularly in Ames. I'm a senator in Kentucky. Two of my sons went to the University of Kentucky, but I went to school in Texas at Baylor, and then I went to medical school at Duke. And Duke, has some pretty good basketball. So does Kentucky, and there's kind of a rivalry. And back in '92, there was this shot. Does anybody remember the Leitner shot? It's one of the most played shots of all time. There's 1.4 seconds to go. Grant Hill throws the ball 3/4 of the length. Christian Leitner gets at the top of the key with 1.4 seconds to go and dribbles once. Can you believe it? Dribbles, turns, and puts in a perfect shot. That day, Leitner was 10 for 10 from the field, 10 for 10 from the line, and it was one of the most amazing games. But people in Kentucky still hate Christian Leitner. Anybody see that movie? There's a movie, I Hate Christian Leitner, And so it was very dangerous, and I started running for office, and one of my first speeches was at the University of Kentucky. And so as I get up there, I'm talking, and I was worried, and I was telling this story because I was in Durham at the time when that shot happened, and my wife is from Kentucky, and all her brothers were big Kentucky fans. And so we're watching the game, and Kentucky goes ahead by making a shot with 1.4 seconds to go. And this was in the old days. There were phones that had cords, and nobody had, ID or anything on their phone. And so the phone starts ringing after Kentucky makes a shot. And it sounds like it's going to be one of her brothers or something calling to razz us about the game. About that time, Leitner's shot goes through, and whoever's on the other end hangs up. We didn't hear from them for a decade until they admitted that they had called. So it's funny, I'm a decade later now running for office, and I'm at the University of Kentucky, and I'm telling this story, and the headline of the newspaper was, Duke's the Blue Devils. A Blue Devil came to Wildcat territory, but he came in peace. One thing you have to be careful is talking about rivalries between schools when you're in politics. We are having a great resurgence or a great opportunity with young people coming together to form this campaign. I have an announcement today to tell you that in the last 30 days we have formed 300 college campuses of Students for AND. People say, well, how are you different? How are you different from the rest of them? Well, I'm different from all of them, Republican or Democrat, because I believe in your right to be left alone. This is your right to privacy. I stood for 10.5 hours on the Senate floor for your right to be left alone. And some people will say, well, what does that mean? Where's the privacy right? I've looked at the Constitution. It doesn't say you have a right to privacy. Well, what it says is, in the 9th Amendment, it says that those rights not listed are not to be disparaged. Basically, what that means is your rights don't have to be listed in the Constitution. What has to be listed is a power to abridge your rights. There's a certain amount of limited powers that were given to the federal government, and everything else is left to you. But one right in particular, the right to have the government not look at your private stuff, was enshrined in the 4th Amendment. In fact, John Adams said that this was the spark that led to the Revolution. Our founding fathers and the colonists were upset. They were pissed off at the British government. They were mad at the British soldiers. The British soldiers were showing up and going house to house with a warrant that had no one's name on it, that was written and signed by the soldiers, not by a judge, and they were rifling through people's papers. They wanted to know if people had paid the stamp tax. The colonists hated the tax, but they also hated the way the tax was being collected, that the government was just showing up at your house and rifling through your papers. Now we have a government that's no longer coming in your house because really we've kind of graduated beyond papers in the castle. What we have now are all of your information's in a cloud. But there's a real question. Is the cloud protected? Is the internet protected? Are your phone records protected? Are your credit card statements protected? The other side, which is most other Republicans and most Democrats, believe that you have no protection. They say the 4th Amendment doesn't apply to records held by a third party. Problem is, all of our records are held by a third party. And now others will say, well, it's just boring old business records. Who cares if the government looks at your records? Well, if I have your Visa bill, I can tell whether you drink. I know that's not true. I can tell whether you smoke. I can tell whether you gamble. I can tell what books you read. I can tell what doctors you go to. I can tell what your medicines are. That's none of the government's business. And some people will say, but terrorists will get us, and terrorists hate us, and they will kill us. Yes, there are bad people around the world. Some of them are in our country, and we should stop them. But you can stop them, and I had this altercation with a certain governor from New Jersey. I'm still trying to explain to him what goes on with the Bill of Rights. You can stop terrorists, you can stop murderers, you can stop people that are here to harm us with the Fourth Amendment. All you have to do is call a judge. If I'm the judge, I'm the biggest defender of privacy in the country, but if you call me and say, well, this Sinarev boy lives over by Boston, the Russians tipped us off that he was a threat, and he flew back to Chechnya, and we have looked at his phone, and now we believe he's called so-and-so, or he's been radicalized here. You now have suspicion. You have someone's name, and you call me, who's a privacy advocate. I'm going to say, yes, you can have a warrant. But I don't want to look at everybody in Boston's phone. I don't want to look at everybody in Iowa's phone. I don't want to look at all of your credit card statements, because that's an invasion of your privacy. If we give up our privacy, then what are we fighting for? What are we fighting against? And how are we different? One of the best statements I heard from somebody was after the Boston bombing, and it was horrific. I'm not downplaying how horrific it was. Innocent people were killed in Boston. Children were killed. What kind of people kill women and children? What kind of people kill innocent people who are not armed? This is crazy who these people are. We should do something about it. But I spoke with a Boston policeman after that, and he said he was there putting tourniquets on, getting help. But he said it was amazing. He was there, and he was part of the chase, going after the other boy, the boy they finally caught, the other brother. But he said it was also amazing to him because when we captured the other boy, he said we didn't beat him to death with a tire iron. He'll get his day in court. Is he guilty? Did he get convicted? Yes. But in our country, you're innocent until proven guilty. This is an amazing thing. This is what we fight for. This is what our young soldiers, men and women, fight for. If we give up for that, aren't we doing a disservice to our soldiers? If we give up while they're gone, soldiers who have given up so much, many of them have lost limbs fighting for our country. If we give up on the Bill of Rights where they're gone, haven't we done a disservice to them? So when we look at this and we think, well, what are we going to do? And should we do anything? Can we catch terrorists? Absolutely we can catch terrorists. In fact, I told the governor this. We can look at more records of terrorists, but I don't want to look at any records of innocent Americans. The thing is that people need to understand this, because sometimes it goes horribly wrong. There was a time in our country when we made mistakes. During the war, we incarcerated 100,000 Japanese because of the way they looked. Nobody now thinks that was the right thing to do, but that happened in our country. During the Vietnam War, we looked at the records of people who were opposed to the war. We also looked at the records of civil rights leaders. There have been times when we made mistakes in our country. Why? Because we didn't follow the Constitution. We didn't individualize the warrants. We didn't ask judges for it. We let government just look. And the problem is it can happen on both sides. You can have Republicans that don't like a certain group. You can have Democrats who don't like a certain group. You don't want to give this kind of extraordinary power to your government. About 3 years ago, they passed something called indefinite detention. It's happening, actually 4 years ago now, 2011. This allows an American citizen to be detained indefinitely without a trial. And I had this debate. We had a fierce debate on the Senate floor, and I'm debating with this other senator, this other Republican senator. I don't like to name names, but he was from Arizona. And I said incredulously, I said, with this law, you will allow an American citizen to be plucked up off the street, sent to Guantanamo Bay with no trial, no lawyer, nothing. And he said, yes, if they're dangerous. So it sort of begs the question, doesn't it? Who gets to decide who's dangerous and who's not dangerous? And I thought to myself of the times when we've gotten it wrong. The Japanese internment, what happened in the Civil Rights era. But I also thought of one particular person, this guy named Richard Jewell. You're all too young. Now, I've been telling the story. My wife says, most of the kids were not born when this happened. Richard Jewell was the guy they said was the Olympic bomber. This was Centennial Park. You probably were born, but it was probably 15 years ago. Everybody said he did it. He fit the profile. He had glasses. I see a few of you out there. He had a backpack. I see a few more of you out there. He was an introvert. And then surprisingly, one of the characteristics of being guilty was that he tried to help people afterwards. Everybody said he did it. Every media outlet said, Richard Jewell is the bomber. He's guilty. He was convicted on TV within an hour. The only problem was he didn't do it. He was completely and entirely innocent. This is a reason, an extreme reason, but why you have trials. And I thought to myself, what if Richard Jewell had been a black man in 1920? He might not have lived to see the end of the day. The Bill of Rights is about protecting minority rights. And you say, well, I'm not a minority. Well, you can be a minority because of the color of your skin or the shade of your ideology. There's a lot of reasons why you can be a minority. You can be a minority because you're an evangelical Christian, because you're Jewish. You can be a minority because you don't believe in God. You can also be a minority because you're part of an ethnic group. But no matter what you are, who you are, if you've ever had an unorthodox idea, you need the Bill of Rights. And you need the Bill of Rights to believe that we are innocent until proven guilty. That's a problem. We're letting that slip away from us. We have a government that's gone crazy. And a lot of Republicans will say it invades every nook and cranny of business. Taxes and regulations are making it uncompetitive in this country, and jobs are going overseas. And that's right. And a lot of Republicans will tell you that. But I'm one of the few Republicans who will say, you know what? Big government has so screwed up the war on drugs that we put people in jail for decades now for drugs. And you know what I'll tell you? I don't want anybody put in jail who's not been a violent criminal for smoking pot or for other drug crimes. Let's look at rehabilitation. I think incarceration is a mistake. Woo! That's not an endorsement, all right? Mary Matterson lives up in Mason City. She was foolish. In fact, I think you could say she was an idiot. She probably would say that as well. She was a meth addict. You want to die in about 6 months? Be a meth addict. So there's nothing pleasant or great about some of these things that people do. But she was stopped. She was convicted. She had never committed another crime, had no record. There was no violence committed in what she did. She was given 15 years in prison. Mandatory. The judge has no discretion. This is called a mandatory minimum, where you go before a judge, sometimes in your first crime. And the way it works when you hang around with a bunch of dumb people who are doing this, the other dumb people testify against you, and sometimes you get left literally holding the bag. But this isn't uncommon. There was a woman by the name of Jill Lockwood. She was addicted to painkillers. A lot of painkillers are Tylenol and then a narcotic like hydroxycodone. Lortab is 95% Tylenol, hydroxycodone. Jill Lockwood was addicted to drugs for one reason or another. She was a nurse. She wrote a false prescription, should be against the law. She was given 15 years in prison though. One of the ways they kept her in prison so long, they measured the drug by the total weight. Well, Lortab's 95% Tylenol, which means it's 95% of the weight is for something that's legal, but she gets the whole weight and she gets 15 years in jail, no parole. Many of these things are no parole, no probation. If you ever do get out, and when you get out, how do you get a job when you're a convicted felon? And then you compound this by looking at the war on drugs and finding out that 3 out of 4 people in prison for drugs are black or brown. Why? Is the government racist? Are they just rounding up black and brown people? Not really. But what happens is, if you live in a poor area of town, particularly in the big city, there happens to be more crime there. So the police go there every day to where there's more crime. And it just so happens also there's a higher propensity of ethnic minorities in the poor cities in town. You do that day in, day out, what happens? The marijuana arrest, I think a relatively benign crime between you and me, end up being 15 to 1 black to white. And so the people in jail end up being black and brown and primarily poor. You look at some of the other things we've done. We fixed some of this, but it still exists. There's a disparity in what we treat people as far as crack and powder cocaine. Well, it turned out there was an ethnic difference as well. Richer white kids used powder cocaine when they were abusing cocaine, and it tended to be black kids using crack cocaine. The penalty was 100-fold different. And while the president and I don't agree with a lot, he has been pardoning some of these people. Some of these people are still in jail 15 years later for crack cocaine, and it's ridiculous. Here's the thing. Jeb Bush went to Andover, all right? I don't begrudge him that. He comes from a rich, wealthy family. Andover is an elite prep school up in the Northeast. Good for them. I have no problem with that. He says, well, I smoked some pot when I was at Andover. I don't care. Good for him. But what I do care is that he's not only opposed to changing any of the laws on drugs, he's opposed even to medical marijuana. So what does that mean? Let's say I've got a 2-year-old that has seizures, and they have seizures so much that all of the routine medication that the FDA has approved don't work. And some of the medications have some other side effects that make my child even sicker. They're now starting to do cannabis oil for seizures. Do I absolutely, can I tell you it worked? No, but if my kid has 200 seizures a day, I'd want the chance to do it. If you don't support medical marijuana, you support putting that person's parents in jail and or taking the child away from the parent. That is so out of step, but it's so hypocritical because here's a wealthy kid going to Andover who the police are never going to Andover, okay? The police are going to the south side of Chicago. So that's hypocrisy, and it ought to end. And what I would say is, let's just end the war on drugs for all and treat it as a rehabilitation problem, as an addiction. How am I different from the other candidates? Different than every Republican candidate and every Democrat candidate? Because I'm not eager for war, and I'm not eager for more intervention in the Middle East, and frankly, I'm not sending 500,000 of you back over there. I am not sending you back over there. If there is one true thing in the Middle East, it's that when we topple secular dictators, chaos ensues, radical Islam rises, and we're actually more at risk. Gaddafi, dictator. If he was walking down the street, I wouldn't feed him, okay? Same with Assad in Syria. Dictator, bad guy, walking down the street, I'm not giving him food. But at the same time, toppling them was a mistake. Hillary Clinton, it was her brilliant idea that we were going to topple Gaddafi. We're going to get rid of Gaddafi. Hillary Clinton's so tough, she can fight war. Barack Obama backed her up. Guess what? There was no vote. The Constitution says Congress votes on whether we go to war. There has been no vote on the Libyan war, and there's been no vote on the current war in the Middle East. You're supposed to have a vote through your representative. It's not supposed to be decided by one person. In fact, Madison wrote, he says that history demonstrates what the Constitution confirms, that the executive branch is most likely to go to war, therefore we gave that power to Congress. War is only supposed to be initiated by Congress. But what has happened is we've gotten so involved, and we always think there's someone we should pick. Well, you know what? Sometimes they're both bad. Sometimes they're both evil, and you have to decide, you know what? In picking one evil side and toppling them, are we risking and making ourselves less safe? Or are we making the region more chaotic? Look at Syria. Syria, for the last 3 or 4 years, has had this civil war going on. On the one side, you have Assad. He probably gassed his own people. There's significant evidence saying he did. On the other side, you have these Islamic rebel groups, 1,500 of them, all right? And so caught in the middle are about 2 million Christians. And you say, well, I didn't know there was all those Christians over there, which reminds me of a story. One of my buddies from medical school was from Syria. His dad was from Syria. And I said, well, are you guys Christian? He said, oh, yeah. And I said, well, how long? And he said, a hell of a lot longer than your family. We don't think of that. A lot of us came from, our ancestors may have come from Northern Europe. You may not have become Christian until 600, 700, 800 AD. In Syria, there are people who have been Christians since the time of Jesus. So anyway, you have 2 million Christians. More Christians live in Syria than any other place in the Middle East other than Egypt. They're caught in the middle. The Assad family, for as evil as they are, have typically protected the Christians, and they've lived somewhat in an uneasy peace for a couple of generations in Syria. In fact, the Iraq War, there's 250,000 Christians in Iraq. Where did they go? They went to Syria after they saw the government that we helped to impose, because they were going to live under the Sharia law or under the Shiite government. But in Syria, you have 2 million Christians there, and you've got Assad on one side and ISIS. Even to this day, if you ask them, if we had all 2 million Christians and we could do a Gallup poll, who would you rather lead you, Assad or ISIS? Not one of them are going to pick the barbarity of ISIS. They'd pick Assad. But what have we done? We sided with the people trying to topple Assad. It's crazy. We've sided with people who are essentially allies of Al-Qaeda. We've sided with people essentially that were allies of ISIS. Now, what will the people tell you in Washington? The sophisticated people in Washington that I deal with? They'll say, well, we were just for the Syrian moderates. And I said, really? Do you speak Arabic? I said, can you vouch that these people really are moderate and they actually do like America and they're going to be our great bosom friends after this? Hell no, they just hate Assad. They want our weapons. But the problem is many of them hate us too. And so we poured weapons in. 600 tons of weapons went from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and us into Syria. But what happened? Many of the weapons just got scarfed up by ISIS. In fact, one CIA analyst said about the Syrian moderates, he said the only thing moderate about them is their ability to fight. So what do we have now? We've got ISIS riding around, and ISIS is a problem. They're barbaric. They're beyond what you can even imagine. But they ride around in $1 billion worth of U.S. Humvees. So they're riding around on weapons. So when they asked me in the debate, what are you going to do about ISIS? I said, maybe we should start by not arming them. And that's a little facetious, but there's some truth to it. Maybe we should start by not arming them. $1 billion worth of U.S. Humvees. They also have $1 billion in cash that they confiscated, U.S. dollars left behind. So they ride around our Humvees and they pay their soldiers with our money. They have anti-tank weapons that we gave them. We gave anti-tank weapons, not directly to ISIS, to some so-called moderate groups in Syria, and some of these groups disbanded and gave their weapons, or they were overrun by ISIS. Many of the groups that we gave weapons to have said when they're done with Assad, they're going to attack Israel. But I thought Israel was our ally. So now we're giving weapons to people who actually really don't like us and also hate Israel as well. So it's like, couldn't we just sort of have as a prerequisite before we get started, we don't give money or arms to people who hate us? For goodness sakes, couldn't we just start there? But you have a mess over there. And so I think what we ought to ask is, look, Republicans have been wrong. Democrats have been wrong. Maybe we need another way that's neither Republican or Democrat that says, you know what? Let's take care of America's interests first. If we want a new and different message that's going to attract young people to the party and bring in new people that may not all be Republican, I think what we have to do is become the party of the entire Bill of Rights. I talked a little bit about the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is your right to be left alone, your right to privacy, the right that the government can't enter your house or enter your records without a warrant that has your name on it. But there's other amendments. The Fifth and Sixth Amendment are about justice. The Fifth Amendment says they can't take your property. We now have a government, thanks to some people, what's that guy's name? Trump? Here's a guy who loves the government. Why would any conservative vote for this guy? He loves the government to go into a town and take and condemn property so he can build a casino. He loves the government to use eminent domain. In fact, he went into a town in Atlantic City, built a casino through eminent domain, and one woman wouldn't sell. So he sent the thugs of government after her to take her house. She took him to court, and she fought him for years, and she finally beat him. But it doesn't always happen. Typically, the thugs win. The people with money win. So Trump says, well, yeah, I give to both sides. I give to the Republicans and Democrats because when I give them money, they'll do whatever the hell I tell them to do. Really, that's what I thought was wrong with government, is that special interests were buying and selling government. But we have to decide. We got to decide whether or not property is yours, if you have title to it, or whether it's relative, and that the government can come in and transfer property from one to another. There's also another way the government's taking your property. It's called civil asset forfeiture. Civil asset forfeiture is where, and I'm not making this up, you're riding down the street and you're pulled over by the government. They pull you over and they say, do you have any money? And you say, yes, I've got $1,000, I'm going to the dentist. And you might be thinking to yourself, who carries $1,000 to go to the dentist? Most people don't, but poor people sometimes do. One reason you're poor, you're not very organized. One reason you're poor, you don't have a bank account, you live from foot to mouth, and sometimes you've got $1,000 and you are going to the dentist. So people do sometimes have legitimate reasons for having cash. But really, I don't care. It's none of the government's business if you've not committed a crime. What does the government do? They say, give it to me. I'm not making this up. If you tell the government you're in your car that you have money, they'll say, give it to me. And you'll protest and you'll say, what have I done? What crime am I being charged with? And they'll say, we haven't decided yet, and we'll see. Many times people are never charged. But you know what the government will then say if you get hostile and you say, I'm going to get a lawyer? They'll say, we'll give you half of it right now if you'll sign an agreement not to sue us. Why does the government do this? We give the government, the people who take your money, an incentive. They get a percentage of what they take. So some of it goes to the federal government and some of it goes to the local police department. So there was a case a while back of a motel, the Caswell Motel, owned by a family in New Jersey. It had been owned for a long period of time. It was completely paid off. The government came to them and said, 8 people have been convicted of selling drugs from your motel, so we're taking the fruits of this evil deed of selling drugs. It's like, well, we kicked them out. We didn't know they were selling drugs, and it happens in every hotel in sort of poor areas that somebody's inevitably in the hotel selling drugs on occasion. It was like 8 people out of like 140,000 people over a 14-year period. It was ridiculous. The government took their hotel. Why did they choose the Caswell Hotel? Because it was completely paid off. All the other hotels had liens, and the government knows you can't get your cash from people. You can't shake them down if the bank has a lien on the hotel. People fought back, and we are fighting back. I have legislation that says something very simple. The government can't take your stuff. The government can't take your money without a conviction. Why in the world would we let the government take something from somebody who's not been convicted of a crime? But then, look at who's affected by civil asset forfeiture. Rich people in the suburbs aren't having this problem. It's typically poor, black, brown, and it's in the city. So you ask, why are people angry? And some of you may ask this, and you may not agree with this, but you're like, why are people running around angry? Why are they rioting and doing all this? And don't get me wrong, there is no excuse for rioting. There is no excuse for breaking windows of someone's store. There's no excuse for stealing. But you got to think to yourself and understand a little bit about why people are unhappy if we want to change the system to make it where we can live in peace and more harmony. In Ferguson, there was all that rioting over the shooting. That was some of it. But you know the other reason they were rioting? 1/3 of the city's revenue was collected through fines. Now, if one of you get a $100 fine or a $200 ticket, you're mad, and your parents will probably help you pay for the ticket, or you'll pay for it. But you know, when you're poor and you get a $200 ticket, it can be devastating. It can mean the difference between keeping your car or not keeping your car. We have to just think about how we've gone crazy. But you know, as Republicans, a lot of working class people and poor people think, I'm never voting for a Republican. Guess what? What if we as Republicans were the champion of the poor? What if we were the champion of those who are being oppressed by government? Who would say that the war on drugs is unfair to poor and often ethnic minorities? If we said civil assets forfeiture was unfair to poor and ethnic minorities? I'm going to leave you with one other story of injustice. The 6th Amendment says you have a right to a trial by jury, but it also says you have the right to a speedy trial. There was a young man by the name of Khalif Browder. It's a 16-year-old black kid in the Bronx. He was arrested and accused of a crime. Incidentally, accused of a crime by a guy who wasn't even in the country legally and whose story changed several times. 16 years old, he was sent to Rikers Island. He was kept in Rikers Island for 3 years without a trial. 2 years of the time, he was kept in solitary confinement. So he's accused of a crime, doesn't get a trial, and he's in Rikers Island. Why? He couldn't make bail, or he had some other teenage offense and they wouldn't give him bail. 3 years without a trial. He was beaten by gangs. I think he may have been beaten by guards. I mean, I don't know what happened to him, but you can imagine it might have been terrible what happened to him in prison. He was never convicted of a crime. He tried to commit suicide in prison more than once. He got out. He's been out about a year and unfortunately did commit suicide about a month ago. That's not what we're about. That's not what America's about. But I'm also telling you, if you're a Republican or you're thinking the Republican Party needs to be bigger to grow so we can win elections, what if we become the party that believes in the Sixth Amendment with the same fervor that we believe in the Second Amendment? That's the kind of party I want to be party of. That's the kind of party that's going to be big enough to win elections. When I think about the kind of party I want to be a part of, I want to be the party of Patrick Henry. You know, the party that with passion defends all of the Bill of Rights for rich, poor, white, black. I also want to be the party that has hope and optimism for all of us. You know, I think of, there's a painter by the name of Robert Henry, he said, paint like a man coming over the hill singing. That's the kind of optimism we need. I think when we become the party of the entire Bill of Rights, we're going to rock and roll to victory. That's what I want to be part of, and I hope you do too. Thank you very much.